Hello everyone and welcome to another Final Fantasy XIV lore video. As many of you might know, the lands of Eorzea are filled with several races of all shapes and sizes. One thing you might not know, however, is that many of said races are not originally native to Eorzea, and I thought I'd talk about each one and how they got there, starting in this video with the shortest, stockiest race, the Lalafell. Lalafells long ago came from the southern seas and the fertile lands there, living a life based around agriculture, with thatched houses connected by underground tunnels, not unlike those seen in something like an ant colony. At this time, the populace was known well for their unmatched skills in horticulture, and this propelled their growth in new colonies and as pioneers, able to work with any kind of land they came across. Although some few made the journey to Eorzea at this time, it wasn't until around the 500th year of the 5th Astral Era when the masses made the trip in longboats, hoping to establish trade with the kobolds upon arrival. They landed upon Vilbrand, the islands in the western area of Eorzea, and after making contact with the kobolds, with whom they found common ground thanks to their respective deities, Oshon the Wanderer, and what would later be Titan, Lord of Crags, they settled upon the southern part of the isle in a small outpost. This outpost would flourish over the years, eventually becoming the city-state of Nim. Here, however, is where the small race began journeying to other parts of Eorzea in the hopes of discovering yet more land to settle. The two groups would eventually become reasonably distinct from each other over the years, but in this case we'll talk about the Plainsfolk first, those who continued to live in Nim and Vilbrand through the years. Among the city-states of the time, Nim did not have the enormous population that others boasted, but stuck to their seafaring ways and eventually formed the Nimian Royal Marines, a fearsome navy that defended the city fiercely, especially after the beginnings of the War of the Magi, as the waves of Voicent came at the city repeatedly. These marines would also be supported by mages that would be an ancestor of modern-day scholars. Although not the direct enemy of Mark, whose aim was to destroy the conjurers of Amdapor, the Nimians still suffered greatly thanks to a plague that would become to be known as the Green Death. A group of sailors arrived on a small island after a fierce storm and were aided by the native Lalafells there, and given an ornate amphora as a gift for their visit. It is commonly thought that this amphora was the initial cause of the plague, and it would be confirmed later that Mark themselves had planted it there to debilitate the Nimians en masse via the powerful voicent concealed within it. The plague caused a horrible change in any unlucky enough to catch it, melting away their facial features, particularly ears and noses, making their limbs shrivel and lose their shape, and having the skin of the afflicted turn a sickly green. The majority of the victims at the time were sealed by their fellows within the Wanderer's Palace, a temple to Oshon at the time, in hopes that a quarantine would prevent the spread of the disease, with the end result being that those within transformed completely into what we call tomberries, fully green with yellow eyes and usually a brown cloak and lantern. In the wake of the war, city-states began drawing up temporary agreements of peace as the lands and seas began to wither and rot due to the vast amounts of ether being drained through the enormous use of magic. In an effort to prevent what was known to be a coming flood, the Nimians contributed to Operation Maelstrom, creating a huge floating net of protective wards around the coast of Nim. Their efforts amounted to little, however, as the raging and furious sea ripped through the city, destroying it entirely, and forcing the remaining few to flee to the upper reaches of the then Lanoskian hills. This flood would result in the 6th Umbral Calamity, destroying much of Eorzea and forcing not only the Nimians, but the rest of its population away. After the waves settled, the remaining Lalafells of Nim would use their seafaring skills to return to the Southern Isles for a time, until rumours of trade and plunder came across the ocean from Limsa Lominsa. The ones who made this journey were joined by their families over time, attracted to the lush fields and farmland of Lanoskia so similar to their own homes, where they would pioneer the settling of the land. Some respectable names would be born into the community, such as Ikuku Iku, who would establish the Gate of Mielvarn to help tax and inspect the incoming ships. In current times, the Plainsfolk thrive within Lanoskia, many being part of naval crews, pirate ships or otherwise partaking in fisheries, with the Fishermen's Guild in Limsa even being led by Wabalago. Now taking a step back in time, we'll examine the origins of the Dunesfolk, those who wandered from the shores of Vilbrand to Yaphayem, which had become a more fertile land since the end of the 5th Umbral Calamity. the Lalafells and other peoples that had come in search of new settlements formed the city of Mark, and like Nim and many others, it simply tried to survive amongst the new lands and perils in the region, with Amdapor already being a much larger settlement at the time. They would soon come into their own greatness, however, as a Lalafell sorceress known as Shatoto would create a means of magic that drew upon the ether surrounding the user, developing the first instance of black magic. With this weapon in hand, Mark rapidly grew their military and became highly formidable and well known. However, with their power came a desire to expand, and with the addition of experimenting with void magic, having studied the Allagan's similar attempts, they began to call Voidsent to bolster their strength yet further. They even implemented a failsafe in the Nullstone, a magic object used to sever the covenant between a mage and a Voidsent, in order to return the latter to its realm. Mark stormed across the land, overtaking several other city-states in their conquest, only being made to stop when the Amdapor, with their creation of white magic, stood against them. Other realms notably improved their own arcane abilities during this time, advancing many civilizations greatly. Once more, the War of the Magi raged, with Mark unleashing their Voidsent upon their enemies, causing the Green Death among the Nimian population, and even overtaking Amdapor Keep. Upon reaching the city of Amdapor, Mark summoned an immensely powerful Voidsent prince known as Diabolos, but the Amdapori managed to stem the tide and even seal Diabolos within the city. Yet again, the effort was much too late, as the land once more withered as the approaching calamity loomed. Mark, in contrast to Nim, had their own plans for escaping the ferocious ocean via creating an enormous ship known as the Ark. Commanding hordes of Voidsent, they would use their power to fly the ship above any of the impending danger to a safe island known as Dunscaith. They did, however, require an extremely powerful specimen to be controlled in order for the ship to set off, and called upon Cessair Blackwind, one of the most renowned void mages of Mark, to guide the way. On the day of the ship's launch, the craft set off without issue, but shortly into its journey, Skithak, the mighty Voidsent being held, broke free of the bind and overran the ship, and in a last-ditch effort to seal her, the remaining mages sacrificed themselves. The ship would sail for many a year, until its discovery nearby the Sea of Clouds. For Marquis citizens, the coming of a new era meant the persecution of any mages of any skill, even those with minor proficiency in the arts. Those wishing to avoid this fled to the wastes of Thanalan, living in the heat and sand for hundreds of years. This new habitat would gradually change the Lalafells of the area, darkening their skin from the centuries of sun, and their eyes would develop a thin membrane to protect from the sandy winds. Once enough time had passed, the descendants of the Magi wished to reclaim their birthright, and many ventured through the wilds to find a new place to settle once more. Finding a spring of water with some of their ancestors' knowledge, the oasis slowly became more populous, eventually springing forth the civilization of Beladaya. 2 more centuries of peace continued until a dispute over the rightful heir to the throne of Beladaya broke out between 2 twin sons of the last sultan. Following this, King Sasawefu's followers would found Sildi, while the followers of Sasagan ul Sisigan would create Uldar. Unfortunately, the 2 sides would eventually war again, with Sildi eventually being destroyed thanks to the magical powder used by Uldar to raise the dead, overwhelming their foes with sheer numbers. The line of Ul would continue to rule until the era of Baldurf Thorn, who overthrew Sasagan III when he learned of Uldar's involvement in creating the powder used against Sildi, the Trader's Spurn. Baldurf and his heirs would rule for over a century as stewards, until reinstating the Ul line once the city-state was stable once more. In current times, Nanamo ul Namo still rules Uldar as Sultana, but her power is greatly diminished, most of it being held by the Syndicate of Uldar. Dunesfolk Lalafell are abundant in Uldar, and the Thanalan area, and many still hold natural affinity for magics, with Kokabuki and his brothers leading the Thaumaturge's Guild. Black magic of the time relies on the user's own ether opposed to the land's, however, making it less dangerous to use consecutively. Before wrapping up, let's take a look at some of the more minor quirks of each type of Lalafell, showing the small but interesting changes developed over their history. Plainsfolk, for example, are still known for their traditional ways of shelter, with many thatched raised buildings, such as those seen at Costa del Sol. They also retain much of the Arcanima skills used by those in Nim, as well as their ancestors from the Southern Isles. The ability to control fairies is strong in Plainsfolk scholars, as well as their still vast knowledge of fishing techniques and navigational methods, something a little more lost to a Dunesfolk thanks to the disuse of the knowledge over time. Dunesfolk, on the other hand, like to represent their patron deity via a gemstone set upon their forehead, a tradition dating back to Mark. They are also known to serve their children tea mixed with a variety of venoms in order to help build a resistance to the creatures later in life. They also find the Ald goat as a symbol of prosperity, often given as gifts to those with newborns. Early culture shows that Dunesfolk also found albino scorpions a sign of a bad omen, and often told stories to misbehaving children to frighten them. Lastly, Dunesfolk Lalafells have a fondness for baked pretzels, with the golden brown colour reminding them of the Thanalan sunset. Finally, in terms of naming conventions, both sides have slightly different methods. Plainsfolk males follow a pattern of ABCB for their names, such as someone like Alcazolka. Dunesfolk males simply double the first two syllables, leading to something like Lolarito Nanarito. Plainsfolk females, on the other hand, follow an ABB-AB method, seen in someone such as Utata Uta. Dunesfolk females are again very similar, but swapping ABB for AAB, seen with Momodi Modi. That's all for today. I thought I'd try something a little different, and as I play as a Lalafell myself, I thought it'd be nice to learn a bit more myself while making this video. If you enjoyed, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel for more Final Fantasy XIV lore, and I'll see you in the next one.